So welcome. My name's Hodges-Long. I'm the host today of this, which is our 5th Lunch and Learn. So we do these every month on the first Thursday. We've just come back after summer break as well, so we missed last month. So without further ado, I just wanted to introduce everybody to James Capper, who's my guest today, from WildHeart Residential Management, and hopefully James can just sort of unmute and give us an intro to what he does on the front line.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, I'm technical director of WildHeart Residential Management. I'm predominantly in the leasehold space, but we also work in sales, receivership, and some PRS. I've been in the sector for coming up to 15 years now, most of that in block and estate management. So my role is really looking at the operational procedures and the impact of Building Safety Act on our business in the occupation phase.
Fantastic, thanks James. And we will be going through Q&A as well as we go along. So I think if you, we've got everybody muted at the moment, but if you've got questions, please do put them in the chat. We want to get through as many questions as we can. And then we will summarise those, and if you want to come off mic at the end and ask your question rather than us just read it, that's perfect. If you want to stay behind the scenes, that's also good. So I think it's always useful just to remind ourselves where we are with the Building Safety Act, because different people on the call have come to this at different times. Some of us, like myself and James, have been there since minus day one. Others have come to this fairly late on. So just to remind in terms of the timeline, I thought I'd just translate this into months. So 99 months now since Grenfell. That was followed by the Building a Safer Future report, which was otherwise known as the Hackett report, which is 88 months. I was a bit surprised by this. The Gateway 1 launched 49 months. So actually Gateway 1, the first gateway for the regulator, launched for the Building Safety Act under the Town and Country Planning Act. The Building Safety Act Royal Assent 41 months ago. And then I think pertinent to this conversation, which I should have mentioned, is I want to try and sort of stay focused if we can on the occupation phase. So the 13 or so thousand buildings that are in scope of the regulator that have people living in them where most of the risk sits. There's been a lot of press attention on what this Building Safety Act and the regulatory regime is doing to new builds in terms of the gateways that they have to go through and what that's doing to new housing supply. We might touch on that, but I think really where I wanted to stay focused was those buildings where lots of people live, which is where there is an opportunity for another Grenfell potentially if it's to all go wrong, rather than a building site that hasn't started yet, although that is important. So on that subject, so 17 months ago, the first back applications were called into the building assessment certificate applications, and we're going to talk about that, and I think in a lot more detail. But yes, that was getting on for a year and a half ago that we started that process. That is the first 1,200 or so buildings of 13,000 that were within that first tranche of call-ups. So that's the timeline. In terms of what we're going to talk about, these are just reminders for myself and James, really, of the things that we discussed that we wanted to discuss onwardly. But looking at, again, through the lens of the occupation phase. So when we talk about Gateway 2 delays, I'd like to talk mainly about remediation and Gateway 2 applications for buildings that already have occupiers in them, rather than a new project that's looking to get out of the ground. So, and again, we'll explain, I think, some of this language as we go through, and forgive me for anybody that knows all of this stuff already. We might have people that are new to this subject that don't necessarily know what all these acronyms might mean and what the gateways are. So James, firstly, I wanted to kick off on the widely trailed or announced changes of management personnel at the Building Safety Regulator, and what we think will happen. And this, for everybody's awareness, just in case you don't know, is the appointment of the previous or ex-Commissioner of the London Fire Brigade, Andy Rowe, as the chair of the Building Safety Regulator Board, and Andy Pugsley from London Fire Brigade as the chief exec of the Building Safety Regulator, alongside the move of the Building Safety Regulator out of the Health and Safety Executive into the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. So that's the background to it. Andy, what what was your reaction when you, Andy, James, what was your reaction when you heard about this management change? Do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? Or?
So I think it's a positive move. There are obvious challenges in the setup, and I think, to be fair, from HSE's point of view, from a standing start, there's a lot of work that went into getting that up and running, and trying to manage that regime. But I think that the lack of communication and expertise on that side has restricted conversations between industry and the regulator. So I think it's a positive step, but it remains to be seen what the timelines look like for that.
Yeah, I mean, I watched with great interest the committee session in Parliament earlier this week, where Andy Rowe came in and gave evidence to them and answered questions from the MPs, and the rhetoric sounded really interesting, in terms of wanting to be open and transparent, accepting that there were problems, and we'll come on to some of those problems in more detail in a minute, and that they want to build a new relationship with industry and sort the problems out and work together in partnership, etc., etc. So I think that's great, because at least now we've got somebody leading that organisation that can speak in public and have a degree of gravitas. I think for me, the proof is in the pudding, really. Will they engage? Will we be able to have an adult conversation about problems and bottlenecks and fixing issues? But, I think ultimately we're all in the same place. We want safer buildings. We want to make sure that, as a result of Grenfell and other tragedies, that we reduce the likelihood of those happening again. But similarly, I don't think we can kill off an entire industry and throw people out of their homes unnecessarily. And that. Do you see that from a fire brigade management perspective? In terms of.
I think at the moment, I'm going to probably jump ahead slightly in terms of delays and that sort of stuff. In my world, in the leasehold sector, managing agents typically working on behalf of the PAP, although the actual Part 4 duties can't be delegated. And there's a trend towards siloing building safety and activity around the regulator within organisations. You look at the competency framework, 8673, for example, that is organisational. I don't think there's too many individuals that can do all of that stuff for a portfolio. But obviously we're reliant as managing agents on the wider supply chain. So structural engineers, fire engineers, etc. And then those building control applications typically aren't done by a managing agent. So there's a degree of kind of upskilling on our side, I think, to be able to work alongside experts and get the standards raised for what is it we're trying to do. Where we've got building work, are we flagging at the right time? We've got the right duty holders, the right professional team appointments. So that's probably quite a steep learning curve for a lot of people in our sector. I think there's a benefit in that anyone coming to the sector now is starting from the same place as everybody else, in terms of this won't be new. This will be kind of always have been normal for a lot of people. But I think it's probably too easy to vent all of the frustrations on communication and timelines at the regulator. There is a lot for our sector certainly to answer.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of conversations where it's sort of binary. It's sort of, it's all the industry's fault or it's all the regulators' fault. I think I've always thought the reality is sort of somewhere in between. I don't think generally there's enough good practice on the industry side and enough good practice on the regulatory side, which ultimately leads to that problem and that disaffection with the solution. It was interesting that Andy Rowe said that a comment in the session about if significant problems weren't fixed by Christmas, then they run the risk of losing the confidence of the industry in the regulator. And it was interesting because I sort of replied to that, sort of saying, well, I think the confidence is already lost. It's about restoring that confidence. It's not about we're all completely confident and you're going to lose it at some point. This has happened over years. And I think from what he was saying, that was a large part of why he was engaged into that role, is because I think everybody realised that a turnaround was needed. There were problems.
I think, we've seen recently interventions at Gateway 3. That is the new regime serving its purpose. That isn't, you know, something that's gone wrong. That is, you haven't done what you said at Gateway 2, or there's an issue there and that needs to be addressed. And I think that focus on new build is still a real problem. If the common goal is to keep people safe in their homes, we really need that focus. And whether BSR within HSE or whatever that looks like when it transitions, I think that there's talk of fast track and this, that, and the other. But ultimately, like you said at the beginning, Matt, the occupation phase is where the risk is, and that's where we need to be focused. Yes, there are political and financial pressures elsewhere on getting new homes built, but I certainly think there needs to be something within the regulator that acknowledges these are existing buildings with limited information, and here's what we're proposing to do to make them better or to make them safe.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think that sort of leads us on to this heading that I put as Gateway 2 delays. So this is, so for everybody that maybe doesn't know, there are 3 gateways that the regulator have put in place. So one is at planning stage, one is at construction stage, and then there's basic occupation stage. So Gateway 2 is the point at which the regulator can stop you from commencing a construction project, but it also applies to notifiable works. So works that require building control and may impact passive or active fire safety systems, etc. So pretty much anything that you want to change in a higher risk building will probably get caught up in Gateway 2 unless it's an emergency work. So for example, if you need to replace all the fire doors in the common areas in a building, that will require a Gateway 2 approval before you can start that work. So one of the impacts of that is that if you identify that you need to do important or urgent work, which isn't emergency works, to a building to make it safer, you have to go through a regulatory gateway. And at the moment, that regulatory gateway is taking, depending on whose data you read, anywhere from sort of 20 to 50 or so weeks to get an approval. It should take no more than 12 weeks based on the service level agreement of the regulator. So there is a huge delay on getting these projects going. So James, can you talk us through how that actually plays out in real life, if you like?
Yeah, so I think that the delays were inevitable because there was a lot of people gearing up for remediation that falls outside of, either cladding through the government funds or internal remediation where there's no developer and we've got to start that process. So we're looking at, is there a developer? Does the landlord meet the net contribution threshold? So that landlord certificate element comes in. Then you've got Section 20 of Landlord and Tenant Act. So we've got to consult these leaseholders, potentially 90-day consultation there. Then your project team appointments, application goes in. You could be looking at a year. Meanwhile, there's a lot of buildings out there, and we've got some ourselves, where fire and rescue or local authority are issuing enforcement notices. And those notices are being undermined by delays and guidance on the regulator side. I think specifically the guidance from BSR, HSE, is to speak to the fire and rescue service and explain the gateway timelines and how you might not meet any deadline on an enforcement notice. Now, if I receive an enforcement notice that says, we believe people in your building are at risk, we're then in this kind of juxtaposition of, we know there's a potential offence under the Building Safety Act, so the PAT might carry out work without the relevant approvals, or there's an offence over here which is actually linked to life safety, and that's one of the real challenges, I think, of everybody wants to do the right thing, and I think they need to consider possibly the guidance on that emergency works threshold, and whether or not those could be the kind of catalyst for that fast track and what that looks like.
Yeah, and there was in Parliament, there was some hint from Dame Judith Hackett that was under review, that perhaps it's too onerous at the moment in terms of that permission. I mean, we've talked before about regularization after the event, that you get on, you do the work, you then submit the information to say, or you notify that you're going to do the work, you submit the information afterwards that says this is how we can demonstrate compliance. And then at some point in the future, you receive your certification rather than a stop-go notice, if you like, up front.
And that still carries the risk that the BSA say this wasn't emergency works, and I guess then what does the outcome of that look like? Are they going to say, actually, we don't like what you've done, or is there a penalty for not having followed the process? And those are the things that particularly the volunteer patch that RMCs and RTMs are really tussling with at the moment. And when you look at as a managing agent, that is Section 20 consultation is kind of the bread and butter major works project management of a lot of agents, and it's a revenue stream. But when you filter that down to leaseholders, for example, on flat entrance doors, if you've got 100 leaseholders and those doors have been surveyed by someone with the appropriate skills, knowledge, experience, behaviour, and they do need to be replaced, you've potentially got 100 independent layperson leaseholders that now need to go through Gateway 2 for their single door, because there is no mechanism there for that work to be packaged up as it would through a service charge. I think those are probably the unintended consequences that we haven't quite got to yet.
That's because the doors are demised to the individual leaseholders, they're not a part of the common parts of the building. So if the same situation happened with the communal fire doors, you can recover that through the service charge because they're communal. It's communal charging as opposed to being demised to an individual leaseholder.
Exactly, and moreover, you can manage it. If the leaseholders collectively came together and said, we want to make one Gateway 2 application, which would be sensible, under what contract are you doing that? Because that isn't an entity that is in the management agreement that's appointed the agent. And there probably are solutions there. There'll be pragmatic discussions with leaseholders around how they can collectively appoint somebody. But those are the challenges. It filters right away through letting agents that are managing these flats and managing repairs on behalf of landlords. And it's that if we're really to get to that culture change, that everyone needs to be on board and understanding when it's building work, when it's an HRB, and what those processes look like.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And then we'll probably talk a bit later about the cost implication of this as well. So we will. So then moving on to the building assessment certificate process. So this is just to explain is when a higher risk building gets called forward by the regulator for assessment, there's a process that the principal accountable person, the PAP, needs to submit 3 things. The first stage, one is their safety case report. Second one is their mandatory occurrence reporting system. And the third one is their resident engagement strategy. So that's uploaded to the regulator along with a fee. And then they work through an assessment process. And at the end of that process, you either receive a building assessment certificate, so a pass, or a notice of refusal. For context, there are 1,300 or so in the system at the moment that have been there for anywhere up to a year and a half. And I think about 200 of the first 1,200 or so have received some form of decision from the regulator. But James, what's your experience been with this process so far?
So I'm in possession of probably one of the first refusals. It's a scheme that we've inherited. There was a transitional phase between the application going in, so the back application went in, change of agent happened in that time, and following a series of requests for information, it became apparent the risk rating, if you like, that was presented in the safety case report had changed significantly, and a new safety case report hadn't gone in. It was pretty much at the point of instruction that we received a back refusal. So we're dealing with contravention notices from BSA, which are fairly prescriptive in terms of what we need to do to put it right. Again, these are linked primarily to Gateway 2, so that there's reasons that these issues haven't been addressed and we're having to mitigate those. I think one of my observations from the sector as a whole, and prior to this current role that I'm in, I'd kind of led an organisation through preparedness for safety case reports. And I think that the piece I keep coming back to is that the PAP and the managing agent, you cannot outsource all of the heavy lifting on this stuff. There are some excellent firms out there that will package up your structural engineer, your fire engineer, and help create that safety case report. But ultimately, you'll get found out when the regulator comes to review it, because whatever they're stating in there around your safety management systems, your resident engagement, you have to be delivering that. You have to be able to evidence that. So I think the notion that there was perhaps a one-off cost, you tender that, you get yourself a consultant, and everything's okay. I think agents probably need to revisit that, and we're starting to see that with the scrutiny of structural assessments in particular. A lot of people, to be fair, on the guidance, thought that a visual assessment might be proportionate. And we're finding now from feedback, BSR want a lot more detail around the structure.
Yeah, and quite often the record information that might support the claims that you're making is not available. So therefore, you're then into, well, can we get away with a visual inspection, or do we need to actually, go down the intrusive route to actually prove what we're saying? We've seen a few coming back where, for example, you make a statement about the fire resistance of the structure, for example, between floors, and they say it's 120 minutes or 90 minutes or whatever, and then they'll say, well, prove it, for example, by showing us the sufficient concrete cover. So that's for anyone that isn't technical, where you've got reinforced concrete, the amount of concrete you've got below the reinforcement and above it to protect the reinforcement of the structure. So you can measure that with a cover meter survey, but that again is another survey that needs to be triggered to go and establish the thickness of the concrete. But that's the kind of level of information they're asking for from my experience.
I think in certainly in the leasehold space, there's a real challenge insofar as media scrutiny of bad actors, increased fees, etc. My personal bugbear with where we are at the moment, linked to this change in BSR management, is somebody needs to revise the joint statement from BSR and the ministry in terms of this information is readily available, get on with it. It shouldn't cost a lot of money. It's not the reality in the built environment for those in the occupation phase. And it's some really tricky conversations with leaseholders, with clients, around how we address that, what is proportionate, what the timelines look like, and what the consequences of not having that are. I think for that statement to be out there still as kind of BSR's baseline of you should all have this, it simply isn't the case.
Yeah. I think the other point I just want to mention with back is that where Gateway 2 for new build is getting all the attention because people are quite rightly upset that they can't build new blocks, or they can't get projects going, or whatever, they can't occupy them. That's understandable. The reality is that the back process, which should be that sort of review of how any particular building is being managed in occupation, and again back to this point of where all the risk to life is, nobody seems to really care about the fact that system is failing. It is not getting the decisions out. I would prefer to see a quicker turnaround to refusal with contravention notices. That means these are the things you've got to go and work on. Whereas with over 1,000 of them stuck awaiting a decision and having been there seemingly potentially rotting for a year and a bit, with endless requests for information, just seems to be a poor way of managing or helping to manage safety within occupied buildings. I don't know what your thoughts are about that time frame.
Tricky one, because what in its broadest terms, what does Building Safety Act do? It presents us with a single person for the finger to be pointed at when something inevitably goes wrong at some stage, and that is that. Now, you do all this work to demonstrate you are identifying and you're managing the risks, but the back application and the certificate doesn't say that building's safe. It just says the PAP has met all the Part 4 duties in terms of what they're being asked to do. And I think that it almost acts, the BSR, as an opt-in. Register your HRB. Well, if it isn't registered, it's not on anyone's radar. I haven't seen any teeth in the enforcement of non-registered HRBs. I don't know whether that's happening. But I guess it's that clarification around what a building assessment certificate is. You know, you could comfortably say the PAP has identified, you know, fire spread and structural risks, and here's the certificate to prove it. And that's going to be once every 5 years, I think. But it's that day-to-day, you know, mandatory occurrence reporting. Are there things that are happening in that building? Are there emerging hazards, e-scooters, things that are changing? How long does that certificate stand against those changes, really?
So the real world implication of receiving a refusal notice, as I understand it, it goes on the public register. We'll come on to that later. You are required to display the refusal notice in a prominent place in the building. And you get intervention notice, but have we seen any sign yet of any kind of enforcement consequence, you know, financial consequence, for example, of receiving a refusal notice for a back, other than having to put it back in again at great cost later?
So in my experience, to be fair to the regulator, HSE met with us to discuss, because these contravention notices are mandated, you know, they come with an expiry, and that is the point where they'll consider further action, prosecution. So they do meet and talk through what is achievable, and then that's agreed. But where you end up with then is taking away from this proportionality in your safety case report to a prescribed fix and a deadline to do it. And you know, there's a reason for that. You haven't demonstrated you've got a handle on the risk, therefore we're going to make you do this by these dates. But I don't think anyone's got as far as non-compliance with a contravention notice, as far as I'm aware.
No, I haven't heard of any. Okay, no, that's good. Right, so moving on, conscious of time. So building safety regulators technology. Now the setup to this, and I bore everybody to tears around data and technology in relation to this, but actually it was interesting that Andy Rowe, the new chair, actually said to Parliament that a number of things around the use of data within the regulator, but he actually said that it's not viable currently and it needs to be sorted out. So just so everybody's aware, there is a lot of information exchange between duty holders, you know, the PAPs, the APs, the principal accountable persons, and the regulator. So there's a registration phase where you need to register a building, which James was talking about. There's a upload of key building information phase. Both of those registration phases need to be kept up to date by law. So if anything changes, you need to update the regulator with changes. So we're looking there at probably 300 or so data points per building times 13,000 buildings, just on occupied buildings. There is then the whole process of, when you're called forward for back, uploading the 3 key documents that they request, and then multiple rounds of requests for information where they effectively send through via email a list of demands for questions to be answered and information to be uploaded, with a 7-day time window for turnaround. So that comes in via email. You've then got 7 days to go and upload the information, and they do multiple rounds of that for every single building that they're taking through the back process. Load into that Gateway 2, Gateway 1, Gateway 3 applications and multiple rounds of questions for that. There is a lot of data changing hands that is potentially going to be used evidentially in the future by the regulator. And they've done all of this with what Andy Rowe actually described as being less than a minimum viable product from an IT perspective. So what are your thoughts, James, in terms of where you've interacted with the BSR from a technology perspective, and you know what's gone wrong and what's gone well?
There were challenges right from the start. You know, there was the issue of PAPs from a freehold perspective, where there might be a principal accountable person for a portfolio of buildings. They would probably have preferred that their managing agents do that registration, but you've then got 2-factor authentication by email to log in every time you want to go back in and make a change. I think they've made some amendments to that now. You can add a contact or point of contact and they can access the application. but that was after the initial, be ready, 1st of October, let's go and register 12,500 buildings. Took a long time. I think the key building information, in my opinion, was probably rushed and a little high level. What percentage of your external wall is glazing, for example? I would like to know the rationale behind whether that was impacting the tranches, and they thought perhaps these ones that have got combustible insulation need to be a higher priority. But and then both from a gateway point of view and the back point of view, some of the file naming protocols and things and the file types that you can be uploaded, it just caused unnecessary difficulty. If we're talking about golden threads of information and making information available to the right person at the right time, then it certainly needs a shift in the right direction from a technology point of view.
So they have recently updated the file naming thing. So this is so everyone's aware. You couldn't upload a file that had any special characters in it or spaces file name. So you had to go and rename all your files and upload them, which was a pain. There are multiple kind of, I think, friction points along the way. We're just having a bit more of a deep dive at the moment into the registration data. And again, there's some significant anomalies there that we're finding that is this sort of, crap in, crap out kind of mentality. There weren't enough checks on the way in when the information was being uploaded, and it was a difficult process that's now led to problems. I hope they do get a grip of it. We've certainly made overtures to say, look, we'd like to reopen the conversation and share some of our learnings around how to manage thousands and thousands of buildings information at scale in a reliable format. But whether that we'll see, again, in terms of where the pain points are at the moment, if everybody's focused on Gateway 2 and new builds, because that's where the media and political pressure is coming from, are they going to be devoting resource into sorting out their technology? I don't know, but we can only hope. Moving on to the charging regime, because again, the 2 points I'm going to split this into. One is a personal bugbear of mine, which is the setting up a regulator that has spotty income, just recovering its own cost and charging registration fees. To me, is not the way you set up a sustainable regulator that needs funding. So my proof points on that are the Financial Conduct Authority. Every registered firm pays an annual registration fee. At the moment, if I've got a building in tranche 5 for the building safety regulator, I pay my 250 quid or whatever it was to register the building, and then I don't give the regulator any more money until potentially 4 or 5 years later when they call forward my back application. So for that particular building, the regulator has received no income for, say, 4 years. Whereas under the FCA model or the ICO model, you've got regular income coming in from every registered firm or building or whatever it is. So that was my first issue. But the more pertinent point is their method of charging for whether it's Gateway 2 or back applications, and how that fits with actually being able to budget for this, to service charge budgeting and recover that cost. How does that actually work in reality, James, from a managing agent's perspective?
So budgeting for an RTM client, for example, firstly, we're looking at when do we think this might get called in. So we're looking at unit count, height, does it have gas? Is there any trigger there that might cause them to call this in early? But the legislation says be on your toes. You could get called in at 28 days. So that is, budgeting for the production of safety case report, any sort of safety management system, software investment, whatever that might be, to be able to manage that. And then the BSR charging scheme itself is largely, in my view, incompatible with Section 20 of the Landlord and Tenant Act. So when we talk about Gateway 2 applications for fire stopping compartmentation works in an HRB, the leaseholders are entitled to be consulted, and the freeholder needs to consult them in order to recover their share of the costs. subject to leaseholder protections. However, as part of that consultation, you're going to have a degree of cost that's going to be passed to the leaseholder, which is BSR's £151 an hour for reviewing your application. And that is largely an unknown. I think if you tied it back to some of the building assessment certificate timeframes, we thought it might be 20 hours for minor application, or depending on the MDT. I think I'd heard 20 hours for each discipline or something, but obviously that's for new build or major remediation. So it really is, it's a gamble, because you don't want to artificially inflate service charges in the current climate, but you need to be realistic, because you'll get that invoice from BSR and perhaps got to pay that within those payment terms. So it poses its own challenge. The actual invoicing, in my experience so far, is pretty dreadful. When we talk about leasehold reform and service charge transparency, I've seen invoices with 5-6 different HRB references, sums for the application for Gateway 2, sums for your building assessment certificate. That's an accounting exercise in itself, just to unpack what is it we're being charged for, which building is this invoice for, and how do we allocate that to the relevant cost schedules. So it's proving tricky, and I think you're right, though, that part of the resource and demand issue is potentially that underfunding. They must have to pay the outsourced MDTs, and if they're not recovering their income until after the fact, how are they managing that cash flow?
Yeah, it baffles me how it runs, but I guess that will come out in the wash. But yeah, you are, so everybody's aware you're on, as you say, £151 an hour for and part thereof for anything that the building safety regulator does in terms of, they call it fee for intervention. There are some minor sort of registration fees of a couple of £100, I think, when you put your back in, from memory, but mainly the cost is in the time. And from what we're seeing, I haven't seen a building yet that's gone through the whole process for a fee less than about £10,000 to £12,000 from the regulator's end. That's let alone the cost of consultants or internal resource for actually responding to all of those questions that come through. Because again, in my experience, when the RFIs come in, all other work stops, because you've got 7 days, including the weekend, to get your response back. And quite often that will involve speaking to your structural engineer and your fire engineer and all sorts of people to be able to find a form of words to answer the regulator's question, which is often quite oblique as well in terms of their use of English. Let's put it that way.
If we take that back to the leasehold space, this issue of demised flat entrance doors, that duty holder, the client, the leaseholder who's going to change their door with their contractor, they're defaulting to principal designer. They're going to have to potentially make a BSR application for £258 or whatever the application fee is, plus £151 an hour to review it. All of a sudden, your £1,500 fire door is going to be £3,000–4,000 if you want to put a principal designer on top of that and manage your building control application and everything else. So it just becomes a bit of a tricky spot, I think, of how do we support, particularly flat entrance doors, I think is probably the main challenge. How do we support leaseholders in remedying those doors without them having to go and make a building control application? You think there's a bottleneck now in terms of Gateway 2 for cladding remediation, 12,500 HRBs, and 50% of them need fire door upgrades, and it's the leaseholder duty. We've got a real challenge on our hands.
Yeah, and that's once you've worked out who's going to pay the bill. That's the next point, isn't it? So moving on. So Grenfell Phase 2, there's some well-intentioned but potentially significantly alarming elements within those Phase 2 recommendations, and I think one of them, and it was discussed in Parliament briefly the other day, was around the reviewing the description of what a higher risk building is. So my personal thought in terms of the rhetoric, and for a whole bunch of reasons, I can't see them turning around and saying, oh, do you know what, we made a mistake, we should have gone with Dame Judith's 30-metre height threshold, not the 18. Let's take a whole load of buildings out of scope. My personal view is they will either find a way to keep it as it is, or they will bring some other types of building into scope. Be interesting to get your view, James. My current view is I don't think they're going to go to 11 metres. I think they're probably going to go care homes or something and move on. But what's your thought, and what would the implication be of bringing a load more buildings back into, or extra buildings into scope?
So there's a lot of managing agents in the sector at the moment who would already differentiate between property types. You'll see people call them large and complex. You know, the difference between your standard 30-unit block of the 3 floors and, you know, a 500-unit complex with 5 or 6 tower blocks and mixed use. So I think the terminology is there for interpretation, but what do we mean by a higher risk building? We've got residents we've got one 7-story just, and we're 18.3 meters. We've got 11 units in there. They're not at higher risk in the sense of multi-fatality issues, you know, on the scale of Grenfell. So I think higher risk terminology can perhaps have a negative effect there. You know, people looking to buy a flat in there, this building is higher risk. Actually, it's higher risk based on this diagram over here. Everything else might be squeaky clean, very rarely, but I think, yeah, certainly large and complex, you know, modern construction types, anything where we've got, you know, we're seeing rollouts for sustainability, we're putting solar panels on buildings, EV chargers. There's potential risk in buildings of all heights there, and how do we really get a focus on where the priority needs to be? And I think it feels like it was intended to be led on volume, but you and I know, Matt, there's a couple of outliers there. I think you've got even less than 11 units somewhere on you.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and I think that use of that language was, you know, it started off as high-rise residential buildings, HRRB, and then redefined as a higher risk building, and now the definition of what a higher risk building is being reviewed. And I think there were, at the time of the legislation coming in, there were a lot of people, including the fire service, saying, look, this is ridiculous, that, you know, that we need more in scope. But I think putting more in, I think there's probably a lot of buildings at the moment that are in scope that shouldn't be, and a lot that should be that aren't. And it's a question of how on earth do you resolve that through legislation, other than just saying everything's included, which again would be over the top. So we'll watch this space. I think that, I mean, we won't spend too long on phase 2 recommendation, but I think that was the main one, I think, pertinent to this conversation that I wanted to bring through. The last one, then we'll go into Q&A, and conscious of time, that the volunteer PAPs I've got here in the building safety. So effectively, this is where you have building management structures or ownership structures that effectively you have leaseholders who are not property management professionals generally, legally responsible for building safety through the legislation. So the legislation says the principal accountable person effectively carries the can legally, and if you are responsible for effectively for the structure of the building and ownership, you become the PAP. And I've completely screwed up the legislation there, but I think everybody gets what I mean. I'm trying to sort of do it very simply. That puts a group typically of volunteers that have got together and done the right thing and said, look, we'll stand up and help run the building that we live in the firing line for unlimited fines and prison time through the Building Safety Act. So there's been a lot of discussion around whether that's proportionate or not, whether that's fair. One of the responses to that when the legislation was being drafted was that they came up with the idea of the Building Safety Director. They put that into the legislation, and that is effectively a physical person or legal person that's employed, remunerated to manage building safety in the building. Therefore, the volunteer directors, if they're unremunerated, can avoid liability. That never moved beyond primary legislation. There was a consultation that's never been responded to by the government. There's no secondary legislation, and therefore there's no guidance. So that's a lot to download, James. But what are your thoughts on the role of volunteer directors at the moment? Are you seeing people just saying, do you know what, I'm not going to do this anymore, I'm going to resign, I didn't sign up for it? Or how do you see this playing out with the sort of buildings you manage?
I think it runs in hand with the common hold leasehold reform debate. I think my experience is that RTM directors in particular, or freehold, resident-led freeholders where they own the building and lease, which is not too dissimilar to common hold. Those directors often have positioned themselves in a way that one of them has some link to maybe a financial career, and they take care of the accounting, or there's one of the directors might be a retired surveyor, etc. And I think that works quite well until you say all of these Part 4 duties are now yours to own. If an offence is committed, I don't think there's any directors and officers or management liability cover out there that would cover beyond potentially a defence cost, but certainly not for any costs of fines for committing an offence. So I guess there's a challenge of, do you try and spread that risk by incurring what is likely to be a significant fee for a building safety director, either a company or a professional, with the adequate PI to take those decisions on your behalf? That's going to be costly. Or do you look at what actually happens if the regulator or anybody else issues a fine to a dormant resident management company that is created with the sole purpose of administering the terms of a lease or common hold? So again, I think that a lot of the legislation is set up to make sure that we know who is accountable, but actually when you follow that trail through enforcement and what does that look like, I'm not too sure there's really any teeth in it. Because if I was an RTM director, you'd think, well, we'll fold this RTM and then there's no one to prosecute, and they're not going to pierce that corporate veil in the same way that they're struggling to get after developers. So it's a tricky position. I think those that are on the common hold side of the current debate in leasehold reform, I think there are certainly enough bad actors out there in terms of property management. But I wouldn't like to say all RTM directors would struggle with this. Lots of them much more experienced than me in their various disciplines. But it's how they value that time, I guess. Do you want to come home from work and do a full-time job? Because that's what this is presenting really on the Building Safety Act. Yeah,
absolutely. No, it's really interesting to see how it plays out. Well, in terms of I still don't have any visibility and haven't met anybody yet that could explain to me how you would, if you were to set up as a building safety director professionally, how you would contract, how you would manage your liability through professional indemnity, what you would charge, and would you be able to provide that service in a way that ultimately a court would agree met the criteria, because it hasn't been defined yet in terms of what does good look like, what is the guidance that you need to comply with. So it'd be interesting to actually, if anyone on the call has any insight into this, because whenever I've asked the question, it's always been met with, well, we're thinking about it still, something will be coming forward in the future. And that was, I think, about a year and a half ago I last heard that from the ministry. So on that basis, I think what we'll do is flip over now for the last few minutes to questions. If anybody would like to put their hand up, please do. Richard's going to administer that. I'll just have a quick look in the written ones. Bit about uploading documents, we can pass over that. Oh, interesting, from Adam, we've received an invoice for a final assessment, and then we received a request for further information. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, we've seen that before. We've seen people that have got to the end of it, have received their final assessment invoice and are still waiting months later for any kind of back to be issued. So there are obviously some problems. We were asked for evidence pack for one block 6 months after we submitted the first iteration of the building safety case report and evidence pack, ultimately submitting the evidence pack twice. Right, yeah, seen that before as well. I think the other point with requests for information, James, is that quite often they're split by the marking criteria, and what we found is quite often, because you can cross-reference them back to each other manually, that you're sure you've answered that question before, and you go back and look and say, oh yeah, 2 RFIs ago, I answered that exact question. So then you start pointing the regulator back to the question that you already, do you point them back and say, I've answered this before, or do you take the medicine and repeat what you said before? So what we've ended up doing is repeating what we said before and then saying, this is a copy of what we submitted in X date. Have you seen that?
No, so not in terms of the granular detail of what they're charging for. I think it's probably an issue in itself of kind of create a task, arrange a meeting. Well, how many applications were discussed in that meeting? Was it just mine? Is it the MDT for just my project?
Yeah.
Am I paying a portion of something? So I guess similarly to the kind of leasehold stuff that's happening now, is it's just about transparency, isn't it? It's what is it that you're charging for? Because the BSR costs, unfortunately, are not subject to the leaseholder protections that were brought in. So that we're as mindful of BSR's own costs as we are of the actual costs of any construction work or remediation.
Yeah, in terms of them being fairly incurred and everything, because it could be a mistake. Melissa raised a point about leaseholders aren't automatically liable for paying to rectify fireproofing of their front doors. Shouldn't be presumed as cost you can on-charge. It depends on the verbiage. Absolutely, and it will also depend on what the issues are and whether there's leaseholder protections in place and developer pledge contributions, relevant defect. Would it be right, James, to say what is something that should seemingly be simple to rectify is actually quite a complicated issue on every occasion?
It is in a lot of cases, and I think there's some recent guidance on enforcement where NFCCC are now saying potentially to Fire and Rescue Service that there is potential that a leaseholder could be in control of those doors, could potentially be an RP in and of themselves. There's obviously the issue of enforcement then. What does that look like? There's no way on earth Fire and Rescue Service are going to start enforcing against individual leaseholders. They're going to go to the PAP who has the means to make that happen, whether by want of repair or breach of the lease for not repairing that door, or whether the door is included in the parts that they're constructed to manage. So it is quite nuanced. I think it's probably broad strokes. My comment earlier that the majority of leases state that the door is demised to the premises, but equally the same guidance for enforcement is now saying future leases should clarify that the doors are forming part of the building, which is fine when you haven't got to go back through 100 years of leases that don't say that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the legal differences, Michelle Blake raised a point about Scotland. And apologies, we've been very sort of England focused here in terms of understanding. She said, we have cases where we are finding having the relevant technical advice on board keeps things right. Absolutely, it's all about getting the right advice. And yes, the legislation does differ. The same with leasehold being different or not having leasehold. So it's very difficult with this. There's so many different branches for this that when we have a conversations around, okay, what country are you in? What height is the building? There's so many different permutations of being compliant that it would be really easier to have one set of rules for the entire UK, but we haven't got it. Luke Anders Lynch, any employer or client pressure group or lobbying intended to expedite current timelines for approval or do better engagement to avoid widespread rejections that maybe regulatory bodies, do they collectively engage? I think there has been, quite a lot of, I don't know whether lobbying would be the right conversations, I think, between the professional groups and the regulator. From a resident perspective, I'm not sure what that interaction has been like. There is the residents panel at the regulator, but again, that residents panel I don't think has ever issued any output from any of its meetings in the last year or two since it was set up. So I'm not sure. I think there is a lot of pressure. There's media pressure, there's political pressure, there's a lot of pressure being applied. I think whether it's being applied in the right way, I don't know, James, what do you think on that?
And I think the comments from the select committee this week around 100 new people into BSR to help with backlogs, etc. It's who are those people? What skill set do they bring? What are the areas that they're going to focus on? We've seen BSR do a couple of conferences. property managers, as I mentioned earlier, there's a need for managing agents in general to upskill and to really get our heads around what's happening in terms of the HRB regime. TPI Property Institute, they're doing lots of courses, CPD. We've obviously got suggestion or planning rather for mandatory qualification of managing agents that will improve the understanding of the buildings that we manage and the processes involved. A lot more exposure to building control via the regulator and local authority building control. But I think in terms of where we are with BSR, it depends how they apply that additional resource. At the moment, I think if you ask the question to BSR, is this building work? The stock response would be consult a building control professional. Now, if there are no building control professionals within the BSR, it might be towards why we've got some of the delays for everything being outsourced.
Yeah, absolutely. Neville has said so. Well, a couple of things, but he said he hasn't received any invoices for his approved gateway. Well, first of all, congratulations, Neville, for getting some gateway 2 submissions approved. That's fantastic, and I couldn't possibly comment on the invoices, but just keep the money accrued and maybe have a Christmas party or something. If the BSR is always struggling with capacity meeting gateway deadlines, what interest would? I don't think they would have a lot of interest in increasing the scope, but I'm not sure that they'll be a decision maker in that process, but we will see. But the counter argument, I think, would be that if we're letting potentially unsafe buildings slip through at scale, should the reason not to change the scope be the regulator's inability to regulate? So I think there's an interesting conversation behind the scenes to be had. So I'm just rushing for time. 3 identical blocks with 3 different MDTs, and then have totally different requests for information. Yeah, I think they did talk about that as one of the changes they're making at the regulator to look more at the portfolio level, which they hadn't been doing, and then also inboarding MDTs, because at the moment they're stood up in remote areas and there's management issues. Has anyone received an intervention notice that relates to guidance that was released after they submitted their building safety case and related docs? Long answer, but not intervention notice, but certainly shifting RFIs I've seen, where the RFIs seem to be a conversation spread out with 2 or 3 months in between, rather than assessing the submission at the time of submission. It's an evolution rather than a point in time check.
And I think it comes back to that cost implication on the charging scheme as well. If you had the full site to prepare your safety case and safety case report before that guidance came out, and you've submitted it, you've paid for it, you've paid to be rejected, you've now got to go back in and pay again to have that reviewed. Is there an argument there that actually the guidance that was issued might have been helpful before we received that first invoice and the first rejection?
I think, can I sorry, because that was my question in relation to the intervention notice about the guidance that was released after the submission. This goes back, I won't mention any building names or anything like that, but this was a submission that we did with the building safety case. We submitted the MOR and the resident engagement strategy, and then it came back and said that we needed to align the resident engagement strategy, which we'd already done anyway, but in line with the legislation that had been released, or sorry, not legislation, guidance that had been released after we'd submitted it. So it was kind of like chicken or the egg.
Provided that criteria afterwards and then asked you to map to it when you'd already...
Sorry, just say that again.
So they've given you the criteria for what they're assessing on after you'd already submitted.
After, yeah. So it was like I say, it was to do with the resident engagement strategy, and all we had to do was tweak it a little bit, but it had been part of an intervention notice that we had to go back and redo it in line with something that had been received after. And it's seen as a live document, so it's an ever-evolving beast, is the building safety case report itself anyway. So if they'd have asked us to re-release the report The other thing is, just to add to this, is that we've received a letter recently regarding one of our submissions. We've had four requested to be submitted, and one of them is now where we've got to go through and explain where the information is in the report, asking us which page it mentions. For instance, where we've mentioned about mandatory occurrence reporting in the report, can we highlight which page number that relates to in the report, which obviously is quite a painstaking task when it comes to that, because there are over, I think there's 11 pages on this notice that we've received, and all it is cross-referencing in a report that they've already received several months previously. So it is quite an arduous task.
It's not.
Sorry, I just took the stage there. I'll
conscious of time because we've overrun. Adam, can I pick up that with you later? Let's have a chat about it afterwards.
Yeah, no problem. I really appreciate that.
Just to quickly answer Duncan's question, I think the answer to his question about if they haven't got a building assessment certificate yet, that won't stop you submitting a Gateway 2 application for doing works. You don't have to get one before the other. The vast majority, as I say, probably only 50 or 60 buildings in the entire country have got the building assessment certificate back.
I think it's just that HRB reference number, isn't it, that they'll look for them.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I'm going to have to draw stumps on this. We'll go through the questions and see if there's any other. And again, if you felt you wanted to ask a question and didn't, then please feel free to reach out to myself or James. Should have done that. Hopefully we'll see you again on the 2nd of October. I'll let you know all soon what we're going to be talking about, but it's going to be probably around wellness and remediation, the sort of the human impact of what's going on. That's not the technical stuff. And that will be on the 2nd of October. And then again, please feel free to reach out to me. We will be sending out a copy of the slides, a link to the slides, a link to the YouTube recording, all that sort of stuff will come out in the usual way via email. And that just leaves me to say thanks, James, and thank you to everybody for coming along. And hopefully we'll see you next month if we don't see you before. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.